In Homer's The Odyssey, there's a moment where the Greek warrior Menelaus finds himself blown off course. He was sailing, finds himself blown off course and stranded on an island. And after being stranded there for a couple weeks, he comes across someone who's able to offer him some assistance. And so he begins to give an account of how he ended up coming to be blown off course. And, he doesn't say, we had bad luck with the weather. He doesn't say, we made a miscalculation in our sailing. He doesn't say there's something wrong with the ship. He says, I must have done something wrong. And so some God judged me and blew me off course and stranded me on this island. This is what Menelaus says. He says, I tell you, I am trapped against my will. I must have sinned against the deathless gods who live in heaven. Please explain which spirit is blocking me from going home across the teeming sea. Now, this quote is really reflective of a view that would have been very common in the ancient world, namely that when you experience a misfortune, whether small or large, that misfortune probably was a judgment of some god on some wrong that you did. Now, in the modern world, we're much less likely to think that small misfortunes in particular are God's judgments on us. If you accidentally lock yourself out of your apartment, you don't think, God is set against me. Although I have to say, last fall, I had a 1 month period where I locked myself out of my apartment 3 times. And so I asked the question. I did. But, in the modern world, when something big happens, some large event, something that unsettles us and shakes us, we still ask the question, is God trying to tell us something in these events? In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln wondered aloud if the Civil War was God's judgment on the United States for the evil of slavery. This is what Abraham Lincoln said. He said, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As it was said 3,000 years ago, still it must be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. We live in a time of tumult. We live in a global pandemic, the worst one that's been seen in 100 years. We live in a time of incredible social and political unrest related to the persistent and unrelenting experience of injustice for Black people in the United States. And as a church community, we've gone through a long season of seeming loss and challenge. Are these God's judgments on us? Is God trying to say something to us in these events? These are the questions that we'll be asking today. We're in the middle of a sermon series titled Sifted, Increased Surrender in Times of Trouble, and I've titled today's sermon, Sifted, God judged me not. Will you pause to pray with me and welcome the presence of the Lord here? Will you come, Lord? Will you be here with us? God, we need you. We need you to speak to us. And I don't have anything to offer or to give to anyone, Lord, apart from you speaking powerfully through your word and by your spirit to people. And God, we just don't want anything less than that. We don't want to mess around with anything less than that. So Lord, would you be speaking here in these next 20 minutes? Would you pour out your Holy Spirit on me now to teach and preach your word with more power and efficacy than I am able on my own? In the name of Jesus, amen. Our text today is from the book of Amos. For time constraints, I'm not going to give all the context that we could give in the book of Amos, which is a challenge for me because I'm a bit of a Bible nerd and I love Bible context, but we're going to give you the real short version here. The book of Amos, the prophet records the oracles of the prophet Amos, who ministered in the 8th century BC in the nation of Israel. And basically, Amos's message to the nation of Israel was, you think that things are fine, but God is going to judge you. And God is going to judge you really for two reasons. First, because you do injustice. He said, you trample on the heads of the poor, you do not hear the cries of the oppressed, you pervert justice in the courts, and God says, I sent you prophets to tell you that this was not acceptable behavior in my sight, and you not only did you not listen to them, you silenced them. You said, prophets, stop talking. And so Amos really says for most of the book, he just lays out these charges and says this is what's happening and why. And by the time we get to verse 9, we're reaching, of chapter 9, we're reaching the end of the book. And Amos switches from saying you're going to be judged to giving an image of what the judgment is going to look like. He gives an image of judgment, and this is really where we're going to start. So what's this image of judgment that Amos offers? He says in verse 9, for I will give the command and I will shake or sift the people of Israel as grain is shaken or sifted in a sieve, and not a pebble will reach the ground. So wherever you see the word shake there in the NIV text, that could be rendered sift as well. Even if you go with the word shake, the image of shaking in a sieve is still literally the image of sifting anyway. So what God is saying here through the prophet Amos is that I'm going to sift you. This is an image from the ancient world of a female Egyptian servant, and you can see she is engaged in the act of sifting. So you can see there she's holding the sieve, and what the little drops that are falling out of the sieve are pieces of grain, and then the pile at the bottom is the grain. And what happens when you sieve in an agricultural context, you gather up all your grain and you put it in the sieve, and then you shake it, and the good stuff, the stuff that you want to keep, passes through the sieve, and all the sort of dirt and rocks and sticks and stuff that you don't want as part of your grain, those get caught in the sieve. They cannot pass through, and they're thrown out with the trash. So you want to pass through. You want the good grain to pass through. So that's the manner that this judgment is going to look like. It's going to look like a sifting. And God says the result is going to be that not a pebble will reach the ground. Not a pebble will reach the ground. So this is going to be a wildly effective sifting. Not a single thing that is, I'm about to double negative myself. Only the things that are supposed to pass through the sieve will pass through. Not a single thing that should not pass through the sieve will pass through. Not a pebble, the text says, will reach the ground. So what can we glean from this image? No pun intended for those of you who know the agricultural context of glean. But what can we glean from this image here? First of all, the method of judgment, and this is a really important point, is passive. Oftentimes when we think of God's judgment, we have this image of God as like an active judge pronouncing a verdict, right? Like everyone's lined up in a row and God says, guilty, innocent, guilty, innocent. That is not what's happening here. What's happening here is that God, through sifting, is creating a sieve, is creating a set of parameters by which all the objects that are in the sieve will judge themselves by revealing themselves to be either able or not able to pass through the sieve. So this is a passive image of judgment, whereby, as opposed to an active verdict pronouncement, it is a passive revealing of what is already true about those of us that are in the sieve. Those who are in the sieve judge themselves. God does not judge them, we judge ourselves. And the goal is to pass through the sieve when we're encountered with one. When God allows events in our lives to be these parameters by which things are revealed about us, the goal is to pass through the sieve. In Amos chapter 9, verse 10, the text says, all the sinners among my people will die by the sword. All those who say, disaster will not overtake or meet us. Now, in this context, when we hear the word sinners, we think, some broad, moral, judgy category. The text here is very specifically about how the word sinners is supposed to be understood. The text says, the sinners, those who say, disaster will not overtake us. And what disaster will not overtake us is really code for here is that God is unconcerned about our actions and our conduct. Right? That's why we're so confident in this context, disaster would not overtake us. So when in the context of Amos here, those who are saying God is unconcerned about our conduct, the prophecies of Amos about injustice, that those are wrong, God's unconcerned, God says those are the people who will not pass through this sieve that is coming. The third thing to take away from this image is that it is essentially a non-powerful image. And I've left this image up here on the slide for so long, just so that we can look at it while I bring up this next point. This is an agricultural image. And in the ancient worlds, work like this, sifting, would have been primarily carried out by women and or servants. And God, in this moment, does something that God does all throughout the scriptures. God identifies himself with the people on the bottom of the social power structures and says to the people who are on the top of those social structures, you are about to be judged by this powerless image. Right? Can you see the force of what God is doing here, identifying himself with the socially powerless? It's as though, we can imagine a sort of an imaginary conversation, between God and Amos and the Israelite officials. The Israelite officials might say something like, disaster won't overtake us because our walls are too thick, our swords are too sharp, and our warriors are too strong. And Amos says, God sees you, your walls, your swords, and your servants, and he raises you a servant woman. And he is going to throw all your walls and all your swords and all your warriors into her sieve, and she is going to shake you, and you will not pass through, and he will throw you out. Right? Can you feel the force of how powerful that is for the Lord to be identifying himself in that way and judging the powerful of the world through an image that the world thinks is inherently powerless? So this is what this judgment is going to look like. At the same time, however, something else is going to happen, something else that's going to be surprising. In Amos chapter 9, verse 11, the text says, in that day, okay, this is Hayom Hahu, in the day, that one, right? So in the day of sifting, and verses, chapter 9, 9 to 10, God is going to do something else. He will also restore David's fallen shelter, repair its broken walls, restore its ruins, rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, the one who will do these things. So somehow at the same time that God's doing this sifting, this revealing God's people in the places where they are unconcerned about God's judgments on their conduct, he's also going to do a restoring action so that more of the nations will come into the family of God. And there's some really interesting stuff about this texture that you don't have time to dive into. But in verse 12, when it says that they may possess the remnant of Edom, that language should not be understood in sort of like a conquering way. The language here is not, and God's people will conquer all the people around them who they've been unable to, and they'll worship the Lord. The surprising thing about this text are the words, all the nations that bear my name. The nations already bear the name of the Lord. And so this language of possessing or inheriting is an image of a filling full of God's people, an enlarging of the household of God. This interpretation was made clear in the Greek translation of this text, which I'm showing right here, so that the remnant of the people, they took out Edom and made it the whole nations, all the people, and all the nations upon whom my name was invoked upon them will search for me. And so the readers just before Jesus' time who translated this into Greek understood as well that this had a nations wide perspective and view upon it. Now, if we didn't have the New Testament, we would sort of at this juncture say, well, that's interesting that God's going to do both of these in the same day. We can maybe puzzle out a little bit about how that's happening, but it would be sort of a confusing, challenging puzzle to work through. But the New Testament authors think that they have an answer about in that day. And in Acts chapter 15, at a council called the Jerusalem Council, essentially, 15 or so years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, a bunch of Gentiles and people from the nations were coming in. They were coming into the family of God. And the Apostle James quoted this text as a way of saying, this is something that we should absolutely have expected to happen. This is Acts chapter 15, verses 14 to 18. This is all the Apostle James speaking. And he says, the words of the prophets are in agreement with the coming in of the nations. As it is written, after this I will return, I'll rebuild David's fallen tent, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name. And so it looks, just looking at the text from here, that verse 17 is the part that's particularly important for this context. But here's the really important thing. Here's the sort of logic behind this. If James is quoting this text, saying that verse 17 is happening, that the rest of humankind is coming to seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, What he's implicitly saying is that verse 16 has also already happened. That this returning and rebuilding of David's fallen tent has somehow taken place, and that's why the nations are able to come in. Now, why would James think that? Why would James think that verse 16 has already happened? And the answer that is affirmed all throughout the New Testament is that in Jesus Christ, the Son of David, in his life and ministry, and chiefly in his death and resurrection, he has achieved the rebuilding of God's people and took on in himself the temple function in his body, so that we don't need a physical temple structure anymore to come to the Lord, but anyone has access to God through the body of Jesus. And so as a result, all the nations can come and bear his name. So here's hopefully the payoff in terms of textual understanding. As Jesus followers, we then can look at this text of Amos 9:9-12, as having two sides to it, right? There's a sifting in verses 9-10 and a restorative climb in verses 9-11. And both of them hinge on the words "in that day." And that day is the cross of Jesus, which is then vindicated by the resurrection. And so followers of Jesus are always living in that space of sifting and restoration, both happening at the cross of Christ. So the cross is both God's sieve, right? The world at the cross is put into the sieve of God and is revealed to be corrupt and selfish and constantly saying God's not concerned about our conduct. And so as we're shaken and sifted there, we are revealed to be unable to pass through. At the same time, Jesus goes into God's sieve for us, and even though he should pass through, he's utterly concerned with God's opinions on the world and our conduct. Jesus takes on our inability to pass through. However, at his resurrection, his work on the cross is vindicated. Jesus, even though he took on our cannot pass throughness, passed through anyways. And because of that, though we are unable to pass through, are able to, because we can participate in the body of Jesus and in his victory. And this is done so that all the nations might have access to join in the family of God as they participate and take on the story of the body of Jesus for themselves. So, for followers of Jesus, today is always that day. Today is always in that day. As people of the cross, today is always that day. Today is both being revealed by the cross to be unconcerned with the purposes and plans of God and having our broken walls and ruins rebuilt. Today is both being revealed to have been content to complacently and selfishly think that the world's injustices would just go away or weren't that big of a deal, or that God would never overtake us and call us to account for them. And at the same time, a time when Jesus is able to place his name on us to enable us to seek him and empower us to invite him and lead others to join God's family through Jesus. So how are we being sifted today? At the beginning, we named a number of ways in which events in the world today are sifting us. Coronavirus, demonstrations and conversations that are happening as a result of the perseverance of the Black Lives Matter movement, church upheaval that we've experienced. Are these God's judgments on us? Well, it depends. If by judgments we have that active verdict pronouncing view in our minds, well, then we don't know. We don't know the mind of God, and we're not authorized interpreters, right? The authors of this book, the scriptures, these people are authorized, inspired interpreters to know exactly how God thinks and feels and participates in the events in human history. That's not us right now. So do we know, if this is sort of active verdict pronouncements? We don't know. If, however, by God's judgments, we talk about the passive sifting and revealing of things that are in us, then absolutely these events function as God's judgments for us in our lives to reveal who we truly are and how God can change and rebuild and renew us. There's an opportunity then for us as people of the cross to read these events as God's judgments. And when we do that, there are three places that we can look. The first is ourselves. We learn things that are revealed about ourselves. Sarah Bournes is the pastor of mission information at Hope Midtown. I'm sure a number of you have gotten to interact with her over the past couple weeks. And she wrote a poem called Exposed when the coronavirus came up. And the poem plays on the word exposed, right? The medical sense of being exposed to something, but at the same time, the revealing that happens when things expose stuff in us. Contemporary Sieves, slide behind. This is what one section of her poem says. Corona is exposing me, my mindless numbing, my endless scrolling, my careless words, and my fragile nerves. And I think that this poem is a great example of the ways in which, as people who sit on both sides of the cross, that when we're sifted by these events, we take them as opportunities to reveal things in us that fall short of the call of Jesus. At the same time, the second place that we can look is God, things that we learn about God in these sorts of times. Things are revealed about us in being shaken in these events, and things are revealed about God. Whenever something comes up and we feel in ourselves that reaction of God couldn't possibly be concerned about this, that's an opportunity for us to say, maybe God is concerned, and maybe my image and my idea of God needs to change. And am I open to that? Am I open to God revealing new things to me about who God is and what God cares about? Or am I going to sort of hold on to this God in a box that I have in my mind? The third place that we look is not so much things that are revealed, but a place of revelation. And it's a place of, it's the practice of looking to the not powerful or the overlooked for voices and experiences that read and critique and reveal things about us. This is what God is doing when he takes on the image of the female servant who's sifting and uses that as the image to sift the powerful in Israel. We are invited to do the same thing, to say, where are the voices that whenever we're in places of advantage or privilege or power, it can be so easy to sort of selfishly be deaf to voices that are lower on the social stratum than we are. And how do we walk out this image of the sifting woman in Amos and say, we will listen and allow ourselves to be read and critiqued by people who are less advantaged than we are? And just to bring this, to really let the rubber hit the road on this, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement in our current moment, for those of us who are white Christians, I feel like for me, something that's being sifted and revealed in this time is how slow and resistant we can be to allow ourselves to be critiqued and prophetically called to something different by the Black experience and Black prophetic voices. And if we were to take that insight and set it along the text of Amos here, I feel like the word of the Lord to us would be, to the extent that we continue to do that, we may not pass through this sieve. And that needs to be wrestled with in a really weighty way. So at the same time that we asked, how are we being sifted today, we also, as people at the cross, asked, how are we being rebuilt today? And in short, these sieves reveal places that are at the same time places of judgment and places where, because of the fertile soil, the surprisingly fertile soil of the cross, the paradoxically fertile soil of the hill of Golgotha, they are also the same places where God can and will rebuild us. That as these events, church challenge, social political upheaval, coronavirus, expose things in us that we would rather not see, that those are the places that, if we will be honest before God and invite him in, that he can not only rebuild us, but use those things as things out from which he can enlarge his family and enlarge the family of God. To close here, just some quick thoughts on key practices for people of the cross who always live in that day. The first practice is confession. We have to say out loud before God, honestly, in prayer and in community, the things we've done wrong. We just have to do that. And to the extent that we don't do that, we're just not able to live honestly before the Lord, which is such a bummer, because God is the one place in all of reality that I know that you can go and confess and not be met with a voice of accusation. So many other places We confess because we were led to confession and out from confession by accusation. But when you go to the Lord and confess honestly the places that you feel ashamed of, or places where you failed, or places where you're ashamed that you were ignorant of, you'll receive conviction, you'll receive correction, but you will not receive accusation. Colossians 1:21 and 22 says, though we were alienated from God and enemies in our minds because of our evil behavior, God has now reconciled us by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. And when you confess before the Lord, he will not accuse you. He won't accuse you. He will call you into conviction and change. But unlike most other places that you can go, you will not be met with accusation. So we have to confess. And then finally, we also have to practice hope, because what we learn at the cross are that the places in which we failed are the places in which God can rebuild and renew. So hope practically looks like joy, and it looks like invitation. Those are at least two ways that hope can be made manifest. In joy, just briefly, we choose to carve out time and do things that just bring us joy to ourselves in a unique way that we're made before God. We just do that. We scandalously take some time, even in the midst of all the world's wrongs, to say, God, I love to laugh before you. God, I love to laugh with my friends. I love to feel the laughter of the Lord peel out from behind my eyes. We just do that. We do that because we have hope that God's not done. And finally, we invite. Invitation, when you don't want to invite someone to something, is a sacrament of hope, because we only invite people into things that we feel like are going somewhere, whether that's in our lives or in organizations we're part of or school settings. Invitation says, I think God's not done here. And so when we invite people into the learnings that we're going through, or pains that we're going through, or whatever story it is that we're living, when we invite people, what we're saying is, God, I hope that you're not done here. And I hope that you can bring this person into your family as well. So has God judged us, or has he judged us not? As people of the cross, we confess that the places we have been sifted and revealed to have missed the mark are at the same time the places where God promises not only to rebuild and restore, but the places by which he will enlarge the family of God. And as such, we too will confess that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. In response to this, I would like to now invite us all to the table of Jesus. So if you want to take a second and get whatever communion elements you have available to you, I'd just love to invite you to take a second and grab those. I can probably hop out of screen sharing, can't I, Drew? All right. The table of the Lord is where we remember who we are. We come to the table of the Lord every week to remember that Jesus has bought us, loved us, and bought us through his work on the cross. And we know that that reconstitutes us every week and reminds us and roots us in who we are. On the night that he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he broke it. He took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Let's take the bread together. In the same way, he took the cup and he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." Let's take the cup together.